Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get into the tips and tricks section of this workshop. And so the main purpose I'm showing this to you guys today is there are a large variety of portfolios out there, but very few of them, in my personal experience, have any augmented reality in them. And so if you do want to differentiate yourself, kind of stand out, and you're interested in more emerging technology, it's worthwhile to play around with these type of tools. Just from personal experience, I come from a UX background. So I spent 3 years in the corporate environment at Kroger Digital, and I recently got a job at a startup called Stream. And so we do augmented reality experiences, mostly for the home improvement and home insurance spaces. And it's a really fun place to work. And like Paul was saying, adding that third dimension to your designs makes it an entirely new problem. And so the way that you can test out these types of principles and concepts is using a tool called Adobe Aero. So if you didn't know already, Adobe Aero is an iPhone and iPad application. Unfortunately, it's not available for Android just yet. But if you do have an iOS device, you can just simply go to the App Store and type in Adobe Aero and get that. They also have a desktop app that if you have the Creative Cloud, you can just go ahead and download. The app is in a beta state, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the desktop app, but as we're going along, you'll see that most of the prototyping you're going to be doing is holding your device in front of you and seeing a live preview. And so if that kind of gets tiresome or it's harder to use touch gestures to get more precision things, always remember that this desktop app is out there, and it allows you to move using a mouse and keyboard and get a little bit more precise controls over more complex experiences. So in the spirit of shared vocabulary that Paul was using, I am going to be using the word experiences a lot. And so just like your design file in Photoshop is just called like a mockup, anything that you create in AR, I'm just going to be referring to as an experience. And then just to clarify, Adobe Aero doesn't do a whole lot of occlusion. So it doesn't really allow things in the real world to block your digital objects. And so it is more in the augmented reality and less in the mixed reality space. But you can create really, really cool things, which I will show towards the end of this workshop. So everything in Adobe Aero is centered around this idea of an anchor. And so the very first thing you're going to do when you launch the application is you're going to scan your space to tell the device what planes are in your room. And so it's going to recognize things like tables and walls. It can recognize both vertical and horizontal planes. And it'll do that with that like dot texture you see in the image. Once it recognizes that plane, you can actually drop an anchor onto that surface to let the app know this is where I want all of my digital objects to kind of hang out around. So this central anchor is not only important for you, but once you share this experience later on, when someone else launches this experience in their space, they're going to use that central anchor as kind of a reference point. So if you created it on a table in your room, but they launch it and they're down by a park or outdoors, they can see the same things, but they're all related to that central anchor. So make sure you choose one that is manageable within your field of view. And then if you don't like where you tapped your anchor, you can always use the anchor icon in the upper right to kind of switch to a new reference point. Another concept I'd like to introduce is the idea of image anchors. So instead of anchoring to a specific point, you can actually use a sticker, for example, or any image as the reference point for your experience. And so the way that's set up in the app is you just choose image anchor as an option, and you tell the app the dimensions of your image anchor. And then once the app finds that anchor in the space, it'll launch your experience directly on top of it. There are really, really cool things you can do with image anchors. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but there are things like you can print images on a t-shirt and have an experience appear above a t-shirt. Or if you want to do like an Apple Watch experience, you can have your Apple Watch show an image and then things can float above that. And so the Adobe Aero app knows to anchor that experience to the image in the scene. So just a few tips if you are going to use an image anchor. Simplicity is really best here, and you don't want to use repeating patterns. So the app is looking for that specific image in the scene. And so if you see a pattern, it might not know where on that pattern to anchor your experience to. What I think is really nice about Aero and makes it such an entry-level tool is they do include a lot of starter assets. So you don't need to know anything about 3D modeling in order to experiment with this tool. The app comes loaded with these 3D assets that you can drop in the scene using the plus sign. Another fun thing to just know about is as you're scrolling this list of starter assets, if you ever come across this 3 dots icon, that lets you know that the asset that Adobe has provided comes with baked in animation. And I'll tell you how to trigger that animation in a few slides. If you do want to take things to the next level and you don't want to just use the pre-baked models that they have included, you can import your own custom assets. And that's what I recommend doing if you are going to showcase this in your portfolio. So it's just as simple, like you see that top line item is starter assets. Right below that is Creative Cloud. And the beauty of everything syncing up is everything that you save in your Creative Cloud library on your machine will instantly be available on your device. The syncing process is impressively fast. So the things that I recommend trying if you already have laying around is a layered PSD file, works great in Aero. 3D objects, I recommend saving as .obj files. That's the file format that I found works the best. And you can export OBJ files directly from a tool called Adobe Dimension, which is their 3D software. And then if you do want to play around with animations, they recommend PNG sequences, but I think those are harder to come across. So creating .gifs also works inside of your Adobe Aero environment. Cool. So now you have an object in the scene. That's great. What do you do with it? The 3D paradigm, I think, is really interesting when you're seeing these images layered on top of the real world. I wish I could snooze my Slack notifications. Okay. Sorry about that. Breaking the fourth wall there for just a minute. Okay. So, dang, I'm going to quit Slack. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you have an object in the scene, you can physically move it with one finger. So you can move it left and right. You can do simple pinch and zoom gestures to make it larger or smaller. And then the only uncommon gesture that you might not be familiar with is if you put 3 fingers on the screen, you can actually lift that object off the table or surface that you have it anchored to. So that's a really nice way to create more floating experiences. I mentioned layered PSD files earlier, so you can actually increase the offset between those layers. So this is a really cool way to make like a pop-up book or like a storybook world where you take those layers and increase the distance between them. And you can do that on the X, Y, and Z axis. Sometimes it is a little bit difficult to click on the actual object that you're trying to select. So I do recommend using that layers panel on the right to make sure you're moving the correct object. Where this really gets fun is when you start adding triggers to the different objects. And so when you click on any object in the scene, you can actually add interactivity to it. And the 3 types of triggers that Adobe Aero supports today are just immediately starting that behavior, triggering the behavior on a tap, and entering proximity. So entering proximity is kind of an interesting one because that allows you to trigger a behavior when the user physically gets close to an object in the scene. So this is a really interesting way to make experiences that are based on discovery, where the user just wanders close to something and then something happens as a result of that. Speaking of behaviors, there are a wide variety of them at launch that are all very different and interesting. The most simple ones are basically anything you can do in the editor, you can also automate. And so that means you can make an object spin, you can make an object grow, and you can make an object move to a specific point, all using the behaviors inside of the Adobe Aero menu. It is worth knowing that in the little panel at the bottom of the screen, when you set the parameters of the motion, you can literally hit the play button and it'll show you that motion live in the preview menu. If you want to get a little more fancy, there is a option to lock objects, to make objects move along a hand-drawn path. So as you can see, that butterfly is moving on a loop-to-loop that I drew with my finger on the iPad. If you don't want objects to float in space, there is also an option to lock them to the ground plane. So if you wanted to have a car driving or a ship sailing, make sure you lock that option and it'll make drawing a path a lot easier for you. I will say I have been frustrated. It's not absolutely simple to get this result every single time. So just use some trial and error and have fun with it. Another behavior that you can do is showing and hiding things. So I like to use this for transitions. If you do want the focus in the experience to be on a specific object, you can make tapping on a different object, make that object disappear and make a new one appear. So play around with the showing and hiding of things for kind of like a introduction to a new object or a transition between multiple objects. I mentioned earlier GIFs and PNG sequences. So the way that comes to life is you can see that fire in the front of the screen. This being Midwest Portfolio Camp, I wanted to keep it camp themed, but the idea is that when the scene starts, I placed an play animation behavior on that GIF that is appearing in the scene. And so basically the app recognizes that I want that animation to play as soon as the experience starts. It plays that animation, and I have the option to make that infinitely loop or play one time. So you can have a lot of fun with these 2D elements if you do want to add some more motion that's a little bit more approachable. You can do animation in tools like Blender, but I find the learning curve for 3D animation to be a tad higher than just creating GIFs. So understanding that you can add fun animations to your scene using GIFs. And then I mentioned earlier the starter assets with those 3 dot icons, including animation. So if you do want to preview a few of those animations, you want to use the play animation feature, whereas with static images like GIFs and PNGs, you want to use the play images function. It is a small distinction, but it is worth noting if you're frustrated that the play animation feature won't actually play your GIF. You can also include audio. I think this is where things start getting different than your traditional 2D or After Effects video animations. So you can basically have sound effects on transitions, as well as just having a general ambience to your scene. And you can see that later in a few of the examples that I put together. This is also an interesting feature around using the viewer as a reference point. And so the function aim that you can add to objects will get any object in the scene to aim at the camera. And as you can see, as I move right and left, the fox kind of looks at me. And this, I think, is a type of interaction that would be very difficult to do in another program. And it's almost trivial to do in Adobe Aero. So it takes less than 5 minutes for you to get something to aim at the camera. And I think this really elevates the experience and makes it more interactive because the viewer feels like they are part of the scene. And then just mentioning orbit, if you do want to do something around like planetary things, you can get things to go all the way around and behind the user and orbit around them or even another object in the scene. One of the last interactions I wanted to mention was launching an external URL. And so think about the future of augmented reality being potentially in commerce or selling things. If you wanted your scene to launch a specific page, you can always link to a specific URL using the behaviors panel inside of Adobe Aero. And then I think this is the most used tab. You can see it up here between edit and preview. But the fun part about designing in augmented reality is you can see your results in real time. So as I'm adding moving gestures, as I'm adding spins, I can literally hop over to that preview tab and see what it's going to look like to other users right away. And so that real-time feedback is super satisfying. So there are ways to make your uh, experiences a little bit more sophisticated. And I just wanted to mention the two ways that I'm aware of, which is either stacking behaviors or adding them in a sequence. And so, and you can see in that top example, the move behavior, the play animation behavior, and the rotate behavior are all going to happen at the exact same time. And that's how you make something a little bit more interesting than just a single behavior happening at once. The bottom example where it says spin, scale, play audio, that's what I would call a sequence. And so that spin is going to happen. There's going to be a short pause. The scale is going to happen. There's going to be a short pause, and then there's going to be a play audio. And so this is going to be if you want there to be an order of operations and you want things to happen one after another. And so Adobe Aero makes it super easy to do this. I just wanted to mention the stack one because that small plus icon underneath rotate isn't always the most discoverable. So you can actually make multiple things happen at the same time. And you can add as many triggers as you want to a single object. So this is all well and good. You're probably wondering like, okay, I saw all this, but what can I actually do with that? So I wanted to put together a portfolio piece that you could, in theory, use in your portfolio to kind of impress any future employers. And so I created a fictional coffee brand called Campgrounds and decided to make a 3D mock-up of it. So my workflow here is something that you can replicate if you have the Adobe Creative Suite. I went directly from Adobe Illustrator into a software called Adobe Dimension. If you haven't heard of that, I'm not going to spend any time on it today, but it is a really good entry-level 3D software that is great for mock-ups specifically. It doesn't include any animation, but it is a great way to create assets for Aero. So I used the place graphic button inside of Adobe Dimension to take my 2D Illustrator file and wrap it onto a 3D coffee bag. Once I had that asset, I could then bring my Creative Cloud asset into Adobe Aero and add interactions to it. And so this is something that I created in a park near my house. I was able to create an experience that would be a fictional promotion for this coffee brand. So I'm going to play this now. Awesome. And so what I really like about augmented reality is you can get the package to do things that a printed mockup just wouldn't be able to do. And so I think it shows your creativity when you're able to put the package design in context. So for this example, near nature, and then that reveal adds a little bit of visual interest that showcases the brand elements. And then the thing about AR experiences that is also really interesting is you can bring the AR experience with you. And so it becomes like a good way to interact with the real world and layer digital assets onto different environments. So I'm just going to show one more example of the capabilities of Adobe Aero. Cool. So the one that makes this a little bit different than the previous one is I did add instructional text as well as tap gestures to this second experience. And so I didn't take this to its like final conclusion, but in theory, someone could actually tap on those other flavors to learn more about them. And so say you're interested in this brand new coffee brand, instead of browsing a website and just reading text about them, seeing those coffee bags in your space and kind of interacting them with them in this more engaging way could be a good way to sell coffee. And so this is something that you can do for pretend projects like I'm doing, or you can do it for client work or school projects. The possibilities are endless, and they're really just based on how creative you want to take this and what assets you have at your disposal. So if you're a really good Procreate Illustrator and you work more in the 2D, you can extend those assets using the offset. But if you're also well-versed in 3D, you can bring those assets into the real world. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is Adobe Stock does a great job lately of including 3D assets. So you don't have to build everything from scratch. For example, that tent that I showed earlier, I got directly from Adobe Stock. Cool. So once you have this experience that you're really proud of and excited to share with future employers, the beauty of Adobe Aero is it makes that super simple. So you can literally share a URL with anyone who has the app. So you would just maybe email your client or future employer and say, hey, if you don't mind downloading this app, I have something really cool to show you. And then once they have the app, clicking on it will immediately launch that experience in their space. And then what is worth noting as well, these videos that I recorded, I didn't have to use special software. There is a record button directly within the Adobe Aero app. So if you just wanted to put a video up on your portfolio website, that's also super easy. I also wanted to show really quickly, if the user doesn't have the app installed, that's not a problem. Adobe does show this splash screen that encourages them to download the app. But this is a fun example of, okay, I took that experience that I shot down by the river, and a friend of mine actually showcased that same experience on their coffee table. And so it's a fun way to kind of divorce the background from the content itself and have a self-contained experience that is very, very shareable. Here's a few resources that when I share off this deck, you guys can click through and get some more inspiration. But that is all the content that I had for you guys, and I'm excited to do some questions.